Welcome to Mrs. Feighery's video number 3 for Chapter 35, America in World War II. The Japanese knew right away that they would have to win the war quickly or lose slowly. They overran the lands that they invaded, winning more land with less losses than ever before. As Japan was attacking Pearl Harbor, they were simultaneously hitting American territories in the far eastern part of Asia, Guam, Wake, and the Philippines. While the Japanese took over the Philippines, U.S. General Douglas MacArthur had to sneak out, but he vowed to return to liberate the islands, and he went to Australia. After the fighters in the Philippines surrendered, they were forced to make the infamous 85-mile Bataan Death March to a prisoner of war camp. Conditions of the march were intensely cruel. On May 6, 1942, the island fortress of Corregidor in Manila Harbor surrendered. The Japanese onrush was finally checked in the Coral Sea by American and Australian forces in the world's first naval battle, where the ships never saw each other. There was fighting with aircrafts via aircraft carriers. When the Japanese tried to seize Midway Island, they were forced back by U.S. Admiral Chester Nimitz, his smaller fleet, during fierce fighting from June 3rd to the 6th, 1942. If they were able to take the island, then they could launch attacks against Pearl Harbor and potentially weaken the Pacific Fleet. Midway proved to be the turning point that stopped Japanese expansion. Admiral Raymond Spruance also helped maneuver the fleet to win, and this victory marked the turning point in the war in the Pacific. No longer would the Japanese take any more land, as the United States began a process called island hopping. The Allies would bypass heavily fortified islands, take over neighboring islands, and starve the resistant forces to death with lack of supplies and constant bombing saturation to push the Japanese back. Also, the Japanese had taken over some islands in the Alaskan chain called the Aleutians. The United States thrusts in the Pacific are shown here in this map. American strategists had to choose among 4 proposed plans for waging war against Japan in the Pacific theater. The first was defeating the Japanese in China by funneling supplies over the Himalayan hump from India. The second was carrying the war into Southeast Asia, which was a proposal that was favored by the British, who could regain Singapore. Heavy bombing of Japan from Chinese air bases was the third option, and the fourth option was island hopping from the South Pacific to within striking distance of the Japanese home islands. This strategy was favored by Douglas MacArthur, and this was the one that was finally chosen and emphasized. In August 1942, America gained control of the Solomon Islands and Guadalcanal in an effort to protect the American lifeline to Australia. The United States and Australian forces under General MacArthur had been fighting to hold on to the southeastern tip of New Guinea. As the scales of war began to tip towards the Americans, the U.S. Navy devastated Japanese supply and troop ships. By island hopping, the U.S. also retook the Aleutian Islands in August of 1943, and in November of that year, Bloody Tarawa and Macon, members of the Gilbert Islands, also fell to the Allies. In January and February of 1944, the Marshall Islands fell to the United States. The assault on the Marianas, including Guam, began June 19, 1944, and with superior planes such as the Hellcat fighter and a U.S. victory the next day on the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the U.S. rolled on, taking the islands and beginning around-the-clock bombing raids over Tokyo and other parts of mainland Japan. By August 1944, MacArthur had fought his way west through the jungle until he held New Guinea. Hitler entered the war with ultra-modern submarine wolf packs. During 1942, more than 500 merchant ships were reported lost, 111 in June alone. Not until 1943 did the Allies get the upper hand against the U-boat, when new technology enabled the Allies to defend against them. Radar, sonar, and breaking the Enigma codes all played a major role in the defense. At the war's end, the true threat of the German submarines became known, as Hitler had been about to unleash a new U-boat that could remain underwater indefinitely and cruise at 17 knots. The turning point of the air-land war against Hitler came in 1942. The British launched a 1,000-plane raid on Cologne in May, and in August they were joined by the U.S. Air Force to drop bombs on German cities. The Germans, under Marshal Erwin Rommel, which was nicknamed the Desert Fox, marched across the North Africa into Egypt and almost made it to the Suez Canal before getting stopped by a joint British and American force. After getting beat up a bit, the Allies pushed Rommel's forces back to Tunisia, more than 1,000 miles away. On the Soviet front, the Russians launched a new blistering counteroffensive, regaining about two-thirds of the land they had lost before a year later. The Soviets had begged the Allies to open up a second front against Hitler, since Soviet forces were dying by the millions. 20 million of them will be lost by the war's end, and the Americans were eager to comply. The British, however, remembering World War I, were not interested in attempting a frontal assault against Germany. Facing British opposition to the frontal assault and the lack of resources, the Americans reluctantly agreed to postpone the invasion of Europe. By 1942, Soviet losses were already in the millions. By the war's end, their casualties would exceed 20 million. There is little wonder why the Kremlin pushed so hard for the Allies to open a second front in the West. FDR was worried that the Soviets would make a separate peace with Germany if they couldn't hold out, much like they had done at the end of World War I. FDR promises in early 1942 that he would open a second front by the end of the year, a promise which would prove to be impossible to keep. Instead of a frontal European assault, the British devised an invasion through North Africa, so that the Allies could cut Hitler's forces through the soft underbelly of the Mediterranean Sea. Thus, a secret attack was coordinated and executed by Dwight D. Eisenhower as they defeated the French troops, but upon meeting the real German soldiers, Americans were set back at Kesserin Pass. This soft underbelly campaign wasn't really successful, as the underbelly wasn't as soft as Churchill had guessed, but important lessons were learned. At the Casablanca Conference, Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill met and agreed on the term of unconditional surrender. The Allies found bitter resistance in Italy, but Sicily finally fell in August of 1943. Italian dictator Mussolini was deposed and a new government was set up. 2 years later, he and his mistress were lynched and killed. Germany didn't leave Italy, however, and for many months more fighting and stalemates occurred, especially at Monte Cassino, where Germans were holed up. The Allies finally took Rome on June 4, 1944, and it wasn't until May 2, 1945, that Axis troops in Italy finally surrendered. Though long and tiring, the Italian invasion did open up Europe, divert some of Hitler's men from the Soviet front, and helped cause Italy to fall. At the Tehran Conference, the Big Three, FDR, Churchill, and Stalin, who was the leader of Russia, met and agreed that the Soviets and the Allies would launch simultaneous attacks. The Allies began plans for a gigantic cross-channel invasion, and a command of the whole operation was entrusted to General Eisenhower. Meanwhile, MacArthur received a fake army to use to distract Germany. Preparations for the invasion were gigantic. Almost 3 million troops with their supplies poured into Britain. Because the U.S. was providing the majority of the fighting men, Eisenhower was chosen as the overall commander for European forces. Normandy, France, being less heavily defended than other parts of the European coast, was to be the invasion point. This is a picture of the Allies landing in Normandy on June 6, 1944. 9-foot ocean swells on invasion day made loading the assault landing craft, such as the one pictured here, treacherous business. Many men were injured or tossed into the sea as the bathtub-like amphibious vessels bobbed wildly up and down alongside troop transports. As the vulnerable boats churned towards the beach, some officers led their tense, grim-faced troops in prayer. One major, recalling the remarkable Battle of Agincourt in 1415, quoted from Shakespeare's Henry V, "He that outlives this day and comes safe home will stand a tiptoe when this day is named." The point of attack was French Normandy, and on June 6, 1944, D-Day began, the amphibious assault on Normandy. The troops hitting the beach faced stiff resistance, but were eventually able to overrun the defense. The Germans were tricked into believing the invasion was happening further north by a fake airdrop. The Allies had already obtained air superiority over France, which enabled them to destroy railroad shipments of reinforcements and bomb gasoline production plants. After heavy resistance, Allied troops, some led by General George S. Patton, finally clawed their way onto land, across the landscape, and deeper into France. With the help of the French underground, Paris was freed in August of 1944. This is a map of World War II, of the campaign in Europe and North Africa. And we'll discuss this more as we discuss the Normandy invasion and the opening of the Second Front in class. This is the works cited page. All the images used in this presentation are taken from the public domain.